Okay, so welcome back to our series on archetypes of the tarot. And this is a series where I'm basically taking a blind approach, a first glance, first blush reading of what the symbolism of each card means, just from my own personal impressions. And then we go into the book and we double check that against what the original explanation for the card that we have is. And so today is kind of an important archetype, maybe one of the most important as far as the makers of the pictorial key are concerned. But we are now officially on the card of the magician, which may seem a bit odd. We're used to seeing a magician with a wand, right, and a top hat, and maybe a cape, and maybe he's putting swords through a box or making things disappear or doing card tricks. Those are the things that we now associate with magicians and magic. But back in ancient times, the magician was actually a scholar, like a learned man, somebody who studied the ways of the world, you could say, the things that make the world possible, I guess you could say in another way. It's like what you're studying is magic. You are a magician or a magi, if we think about the stories of like the gift of the magi. That's what that word means, right? It was kind of like the equivalent today of being like a doctor or a physician, a philosopher, right? Somebody who was wise in the ways of the world. And this card depicts that, right? And so the magician actually has a few features, right? And some of them are really important, right? But we have what I believe are roses, red roses, right? That's a very important symbolic flower, the red rose. We have these other ones that look like lilies. I think they're something else. We'll talk about that another day. That's like an important magic lesson for much later in the future. But suffice it to say, the symbolism of these flowers being here is also very important, and the directions that they're facing. But what's really important about the magician is actually the stuff that he has on his table, right? Or the thing that he has in his hand. And this is supposed to be his wand, right? And if you were a philosopher or a learned man or somebody who knew things was worldly about the world back in the day, we're talking ancient times, your wand was one thing that showed that you knew what you were talking about or that you could talk. And that was this chalk, a stick of chalk. We have the idea of perhaps Socrates or Plato writing their lessons on pieces of slate with a stick of chalk. Okay? Do you know why it's a stick of chalk? Why did they choose to draw with this? If they were just going to erase it anyways, right? You could draw it in the mud, you could draw it in the sand, you could erase it immediately, right? Why did they switch to this? And why did this become the symbol of being a learned man, right? Almost looks like a candle that's burning at both ends, okay? The reason is because they were actually making these sticks for a long time. And the reason they were making these sticks has to do with everything else that's on the table. And so if you basically the inference is that if you had one of these, you are part of this process. You were learned. You understood what all of this stuff meant. And so I'm going to go through it a little bit today, right? Because it is all kind of connected, right? So chalk is made out of two important things, if it's made out of the correct thing, right? Calcium and carbon. It's calcium carbonate, right? So that's a metal, calcium, right? And carbon, which I guess off gases as carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide or whatever it is when you burn it. But it's a metal and it burns. And it has interesting properties when it burns, especially when you grind it up into tiny amounts of powder and then you do something very specific with it. Okay? And it's from that practice that we got people who learned how to write with chalk. Okay? I'm going to go through a bit of the rest of it here and with the stuff I have laid out in front of us. Right? I don't need to tell you that the white is purity, right? He's moving in purity, and the red is love, right? He's loved by God, right? And he's supported. He has a strong foundation that he's built himself out of wood here, the table, right? That's easy. It's got some symbols on it too. I'm sure those are important in some way. But what's really important is the other things that he has on his table, right? I believe that's a stave or a staff, right? That just shows that he's like done the work and he's learned, right? The staff that supports him, right? His own knowledge. But the other three items that are on the table, they're the ones I want to talk about now because they're the other three items that I have on my table, right? And those items are in order as far as I can tell, right? The magician has a cup, and it's important. He has a chalice, right? A goblet, you could say, you know. What does that actually represent? What that actually is a crucible. It's a thing that you put into fire, right? So that you can melt metal, right? And the thing that they would put into the crucible while they were purifying the metal was calcium. It was called calcining or not calcification. No, that's the process of getting calcium in the first place. But they would calcine their crucibles. And why would they do that? They did it to purify the metal. Which metal? The metal is the disc. The disc is actually supposed to be a mirror, right? Or a coin. The reason it's supposed to be a mirror or a coin is because the magicians that were the most expert at separating out what each of the different metals were, they could do something amazing, right? There's two things that they learned how to do. The first was to make the coins in the first place, and I have a bunch here that I've shown you on the channel at various points, right? Probably not best definition because they're a little bit far away, but we've got my silver coin, right? My not so silver coin, right? And then a bunch of the other coins that are available in my time with various amounts of metal in each of them, right? What they figured out how to do back in the day was to separate out all of the metals. Not only that, that was the first one. That's the first trick of the magician, right? Separate out all the different metals in your crucible, right? Or through your process, your scientific process, actually, right? Because these were the first scientists, the ones who figured out how to do this stuff. But that's the first trick. The second trick that they learned how to do was to plate, electroplating. These guys figured out electroplating. I don't know how the heck far back, but a while far back, at least as long as they were making mirrors. But also mirrors back in the day, like a mirror. There are many different kinds of mirrors. One thing you should look up is something called a Chinese magic mirror, right? And that's the mirror that I'm talking about, right? There's actually a great episode on YouTube. It's been out here for years of a toy maker. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I'll have to add it in the comments. But he has an excellent video on the Chinese magic mirror. But where that technology comes from, right, to make a mirror that can show a magical image on the wall, where we get the idea of mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Who is the fairest of them all? Well, it's Snow White, right? You get the Snow White. But actually, Snow White might mean something else. And we'll get into all of that, you know? Everything has its own meanings, right? Everything comes from different times. But that's what the magicians figured out, how to separate everything and how to electroplate. And to them, that must have seemed like magic. You could make any metal seem like any other metal, right? And so when I have my quarter here that's actually got a steel core inside of it that we've electroplated, right, the nickel on top of so that it stays shiny and doesn't rust, right? Or the same with any of my other coins here that have steel cores, right? And will attach to a magnet. Because we did that test, didn't we? And everything attached except for the nickel and my two silver coins, but all the other ones attached. And I guess not my penny either, though. So those are the two things, right? It's like the first step that shows your expertise as a magician, right? You have your cup, right? And your cup is where you separate out the actual parts of matter and nature and magic itself. And this is the proof of your magical ability, right? Is that you could take the cup and use the calcium, right? And you'd sprinkle the little bits of calcium in. And every time there was a little bit of a reaction, you take it out and you raise the temperature and you do it again. They did that at the beginning, and then they figured out that there was a whole bunch more that they could do with it. And so then we get to the sword of the dagger, which is the last of the magician's implements. Right? Everybody sees this, and they see it and they think that it has something to do with like a dagger, right? Like this is the dagger, right? The ritual dagger. They think that it means something to do with like sacrifice or ritual sacrifice or all that kind of stuff. What the dagger actually is it's just a ritual dagger. You're not using it to do anything physically. You're using it to prove something mentally about your capabilities. And what it is it's divination, right? You're showing your ability through God, through God's power, right? To show that you have mastery over creation. But not only that, that you've done it to the full limit of its extent. And that it's basically like you've divided everything into all of its houses, right? And so essentially the sword is, or the dagger in this case, is a representation of the magician's ability to sort the truth from the non-truth and the proof is that they can do all of this. And that's what makes him the magician, right? Because if you were alive a couple thousand years ago and you ran into somebody, maybe from China, maybe from somewhere else, right, who could melt down the atoms of the universe, melt down rocks in a fire, and turn those rocks into this and this. To you, that would have been magic 2,000 years ago, right? And that's what the lesson of the magician is, right? All of the stuff that we've benefited from human technology, all that stuff, was thanks to these guys way back when, right? Who sat down and thought about everything long enough to figure out how many ways you could divide things into actually. All the colors of the rainbow, all the different metals, and what was the limits of your technology at the time, but also your mental capability, right? So if that helps us to understand the magician a little bit better, then that's helpful. That's one way of looking at him. But we're also looking at him as an archetype, right? He does also have the symbol above his head. Uh, that's a very interesting looped X, looped cross, uh, which shows that he's also complete in the two spheres of his mind. But that's for another day. But for the archetypal representation, we've been talking here. I'll put this aside for now. We've been talking about the hero and the two parts of his knowledge, right? The things that he's sure about and the things that he's unsure about, or the two questions that we're going to ask about his character if we were thinking about this as Luke Skywalker, right? And this is his story that he's going to go through and he's going to become the hero at the end. But these are the things that he's going to have to come across and deal with in the meantime as we go through it, right? Those are the three cards, kind of how to understand them, right? Very easily to understand the magician then. Card number 1 in relation to the card number 0 of the hero. 0 is the hero, of course, as we all know, right? But the magician, well, that would be Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? It's the first character that you come across in the story that acts as a guide and tries to point you in the directions that you should go or that you should try, right? It's kind of like a master that weighs things too, right? You think about every story that you've ever heard, ever read, it has a character like this, most likely, right? Because you have your main character, right? The main character has their story that they're going to go through and the things that they're going to have to face. You think of Shrek, donkey. That's the easiest way to understand the archetypal representation, right? It's almost like the things that happen to be true regardless, right? It's like Mother Nature is going to sort you out whether you like it or not. God's going to sort you out whether you like it or not. You have no choice, right? But that's the lesson, right? Use the force, Luke, right? Right? It's like that kind of an energy, that kind of a force within the story. Sometimes that's a good thing, right? If you think about like in the context of those two stories, sometimes this character though can be like because this is a force, right? It's not just it doesn't just have to stay the character. That's one thing I should say about all these things. We're talking about them as archetypes. It's like a force, right? And so in the story of what's that one called? The Count of Monte Cristo, right? You have the character uh, on the island. He's sent to the Chateau d'If, right, to be tortured, and there's the guy that whips him, right, and tests, right, his conviction, tests his belief in God by whipping him as he prays for salvation or prays to be saved, right? It's like that type of an energy in a story, right? The one that's going to come along and be like, because you have your friends, right? But it's like this isn't necessarily a friend. It's the kind of thing where it's like it could be that life lesson, right? Maybe the character doesn't take it into account, and maybe that's why the story gets like much darker, right? It's all those kinds of things. And so that's why the magician is such a strong character in relationship to all the other ones that are going to come after. Because even though those are still strong characters and they still have important roles that they play within how they function as a force, right? The magician is really the like, it's all in one, right? Like this one's going to figure out, is going to determine what the entire direction of everything is going to go based on how those two cards interact, uh, you know, as we go through the story. So that should give us a rough idea of why that card is so important, why it might be on the cover of a book like this, right? I'm going to go to our page about the magician. I'll just further note that this is where the trumps major and their inner symbolism actually begins in the book, and I actually had to go further in to find the lesson about the fool, but it was really important that we had him at the beginning, so we had to do that. So this is where it actually begins in the book, but we've kind of skipped around a little bit. So I'll begin here with the lesson on the magician. A youthful figure in the robe of a magician, having the countenance of divine Apollo, with smile of confidence and shining eyes. Above his head is the mysterious sign of the Holy Spirit, the sign of life, like an endless cord, forming the figure 8 in a horizontal position. About his waist is a serpent cincture, the serpent appearing to devour its own tail. This is familiar to most as a conventional symbol of eternity, but here it indicates more especially the eternity of attainment in the spirit. In the magician's right hand is a wand raised towards heaven, while the left hand is pointing to the earth. The dual sign is known in very high grades of the instituted mysteries. It shows the descent of grace, virtue, and light drawn from things above and derived to things below. The suggestion throughout is therefore the possession and communication of the powers and gifts of the Spirit. On the table in front of the magician are the symbols of the 4 tarot suits, signifying the elements of natural life, which lie like counters before the adept, and he adapts them as he wills. Beneath are roses and lilies, the Flos Campi and Lilium convallium, changed into garden flowers to show the culture of aspiration. This card signifies the divine motive in man, reflecting God, the will in, the liberation of its union with that which is above. It is also the unity of individual being on all planes, and in a very high sense it is thought in the fixation thereof. And I won't read any further because that's stuff that has to do with the intro. It references back to the intro. But that's what they're talking about when they're talking about what the things are. He adapts them as he wills, to his will. right? And that's the mode by which he does it, right? It also references as above, so below. That's another lesson that we'll have to talk about someday, right? But hopefully that gives you a bit more of an idea of what the symbolism of that card is actually kind of pointing towards and what it is that they're actually talking about when they mean that. And something physical in the real world that all of this is tied to, right? Historically, that you can actually go and check if anybody wants to. But this is why we have this and this and this and this and that and everything on the table is because at some point somebody figured out, right, how to separate these and what they could do with them. And it changed the world forever, right? This is the difference. This is why everybody did everything. It's why anything exists. And if you would like more lessons about why I think that that might be the case, then please like, subscribe, comment, share, all the fun stuff as we continue to delve deeper into the mysteries of what the heck is actually going on anywhere. Anyways. So, hope you guys like that. And yeah, we will see you again next time.